He slammed the gavel the moment Jasmine Crockett pushed open the heavy wooden door. She felt every eye in the hearing room latch onto her as the echo reverberated against the walls, mingling with the sharp hush that followed. She was exactly 12 minutes late, and the presiding chairman had been waiting, impatient, annoyed, and more than ready to express his frustration. Yet that was only part of the tension. The real friction was rooted in who she was and what she had come here to do. She paused by the entrance, scanning the narrow rows of worn-out benches. A handful of journalists silently flipped through their notepads. In the back, members of the public leaned forward on the edges of their seats, waiting. A colleague gestured for her to take her place at the wooden table up front, but something felt off. The looming figure in the center seat, the man with the gavel, was the reason for it. He didn't bother hiding his annoyance. As she advanced, her heartbeat quickened, but she kept her face calm. Every movement she made was measured. Every breath she took was deep, collected, and defiant. "You are late," the chairman said, his voice crackling through the microphone that dangled from a simple metal stand. He made no effort to mask the condescension lacing each syllable. The tension in the air felt thick, almost suffocating. Jasmine bit back a rebuttal, opting for composure rather than confrontation. She quietly set her folder on the table. From behind, she heard a rustle of bodies. The entire room felt like it was leaning forward, poised for the slightest shift in the already precarious dynamic. She thought of the months leading up to this moment, how meticulously she had prepared, how every detail had to be flawless, and how each step forward felt like treading on broken glass. For a moment, she closed her eyes. She remembered the relentless phone calls, the letters that never got answered, the heavily redacted documents. She remembered the exhaustion in her own voice as she fought to piece together the truth hidden behind bureaucratic stonewalling. One request after another, denied or still under consideration, every exchange with the powers that be had been like pulling teeth, each small concession an excruciating victory. Now, at last, she stood in the grand hearing room where, theoretically, truth was supposed to stand a fighting chance. Yet the eyes on her, from the chairman's icy glare to the clerk's concerned glance, suggested this place was more about performance than justice. The moment she sat, someone behind her attempted a cough or a greeting, she couldn't be sure which. Immediately, the chairman's gavel struck again. "Silence! We are already behind schedule," he announced, his gaze fixated on Jasmine. "Ms. Crockett, is there a particular reason for your late arrival?" His question left a bitter aftertaste in the air. She met his stare, determined to stay level-headed. "I came as quickly as I could," she replied, her voice even, though she could feel her pulse hammering in her neck. "I informed the clerk about traffic delays." He raised a dismissive hand. Yes, we've heard all of that. Now, if we might begin," he gestured, signaling his own impatience. Her microphone was switched on. She saw the little green light flicker. It was a reminder that, for the moment, she had an official channel through which to speak. A fleeting moment of relief, overshadowed by the suspicion that it would be cut off at the slightest provocation. She had come here to expose a systematic misuse of authority, documents that showed decisions made behind closed doors, budgets diverted to private interests, and voices silenced through intimidation. But in a hearing officiated by the very power structure she aimed to challenge, the path forward would not be straightforward. She cleared her throat, feeling the dryness gather. "I appreciate the chance to testify," she began, though the chairman's cold gaze nearly froze the words on her tongue. She pressed on anyway, turning to gather momentum from the moral force behind her cause. Then, suddenly, a flicker. Her microphone seemed to fade. She stopped, startled by the drop in volume. The green light was still on, but the audio was muffled. A trickle of tension slid down her spine. An uncanny hush filled the air, except for the chairman's pointed sigh. He leaned forward and spoke into his own mic, ensuring his voice dominated the room. "We need to keep this hearing on track," he said, ignoring the technical glitch. "Miss Crockett, kindly make your statement succinct. We have a full docket." She fought the urge to protest the microphone malfunction immediately. If she did, it would look like she was making excuses. Instead, she nodded, leaning a bit closer to the mic, hoping her voice would carry. "Over the past several months, I've been conducting a thorough review of the department's spending and contract allocation." she said. Her voice remained soft, but she spoke with a slow deliberateness, forcing each word to resonate. I've uncovered evidence suggesting that certain contracts have been awarded without the customary public oversight, and in certain instances, large sums of money have disappeared from public ledgers. She paused, waiting for a reaction. None came. The chairman's face remained impassive, though his jaw twitched. A few cameras on tripods clicked softly, capturing every 10th second. More than once, she'd dreamed about this very moment, where she would bring forward proof so undeniable that even the most jaded official would have to listen. But now that she was here, it was as though the entire room was bracing for confrontation, yet unwilling to acknowledge it openly. Her gaze shifted to a small cluster of silent spectators, a few community organizers who had supported her quest, a couple of local reporters who had tried to push the story forward. Their presence was a quiet, moral anchor. If she lost her composure, they would lose hope, so she pressed on. These documents, she began, carefully opening her folder, they show explicit language that indicates a deliberate attempt to circumvent standard procedure for awarding these contracts. He lifted a photocopy to highlight her point. You can see from the signatures that there are only 2 signatories, whereas the law requires at least 4 independent confirmations. She heard a faint beep in her earpiece. Her microphone cut out completely for a fraction of a second, then crackled back to life. She glanced up at the control booth, but the technician's face betrayed no emotion, no admission that anything was amiss. She continued, I would like to enter these documents into the official record. She slid them forward towards the clerk. Before the clerk could respond, the chairman intervened, leaning into his own mic. You've made your point. The clerk will decide what is relevant for the record. His tone was clipped, controlled, brimming with a quiet authority that dared anyone to challenge him. Jasmine's stomach tightened, but she continued in that measured, unwavering voice. These are relevant to the misconduct I am here to describe. She carefully pressed her fingers against the papers, emphasizing their importance. They provide a paper trail indicating... And then her microphone went silent. The green light winked out, leaving the only audible sound in the room the chairman's quiet, deliberate breath. She froze, mouth half open, uncertain whether to speak up without amplification. The hush in the chamber was profound, like everyone had collectively stopped breathing to see what might happen next. For an agonizing beat, she stared at the silent mic, then at the chairman, who was now fiddling with his pen, deliberately ignoring her. A shiver of frustration pulsed through her. This was no technical glitch, it was a deliberate move to stifle her testimony. She swallowed, turning her head slightly so that her voice might still carry to the microphone on the clerk's table. The public deserves to know, she said, her tone faint but still resolute. The moment the words escaped her lips, the chairman held up his gavel, waving it threateningly in the air, a gesture that signaled no further words would be tolerated. Ms. Crockett, we must move forward. Your time is limited. If you have evidence, submit it, but we have heard enough speculative accusations. His words were crisp, final, and drenched in authority. There was no official directive, no official explanation for why her mic had gone silent, just the unsubtle message that she was to be seen, not heard. She forced a smile that was more painful than pleasant. She nodded at the clerk, sliding the documents the rest of the way across the table. The chairman gave a perfunctory nod to another official to speak, effectively sidestepping her entire presentation. Defiance flared in Jasmine's chest. She refused to be relegated to the margins of her own testimony. She glanced at the silent mic, then rose from her seat, steps slow and purposeful. Behind her, she sensed a change in the atmosphere. A few spectators whispered, scandalized by the raw show of power. Others looked anxious, uncertain whether to protest or remain silent. The reporters, initially bored with the procedural drudgery, suddenly focused their cameras anew, capturing the tension in real time. The authority figure was making his stand, but so was Jasmine Crockett. She moved a few inches closer to the chairman, making sure she wasn't doing anything that could be labeled as disruptive or out of order. No raised voice, no rash movement, yet everything about her posture declared that she would not be dismissed. She addressed him directly, her voice louder now, unamplified but startlingly clear. Mr. Chairman, may I clarify some points regarding these documents? He paused, lips pursed in irritation. The sudden confrontation was not part of his script. Slowly, he leaned back, exchanged a glance with one of his colleagues, then turned to her. His expression suggested he thought he had the upper hand, or at least that this was a trivial annoyance he could crush at will. "You are out of order," he said softly. "You have already exceeded your time. Please, take your seat." In that moment, she recognized the pattern. An official hearing staged to appear fair but meticulously orchestrated to silence inconvenient truths. She inhaled, letting the tension sear through her lungs before exhaling. She saw the silent watchers, the minor allies, the scribbling pens of the reporters. She felt the weight of a moral imperative pushing her forward. She would not let them bury the facts in the back pages of an incomplete record. Turning slowly, she saw the second microphone at the opposite end of the table. It was typically reserved for cross-examinations or statements from supporting officials. In a single fluid motion, she stepped toward it. Her movement triggered a stir of confusion among the hearing staff, but no one moved to physically stop her. There was a flicker of amusement in the eyes of one junior official, as if he recognized the audacity of her maneuver. The chairman shifted in his seat, tapping the gavel lightly. A warning. Jasmine reached the microphone, tested it with a soft hello, and found it live. She wasted no time. "These documents," she repeated, her voice echoing across the chamber with more clarity than before, "show a pattern of collusion that must not be dismissed." She flattened one of the pages on the table, pointing to specific lines as though the cameras could capture the evidence. "You can see on page 3 that there's a reference to a confidential arrangement. It specifies discretionary power over a fund that was never disclosed to the general ledger." The chairman cut in, leaning toward his mic. "Ms. Crockett, you are using a microphone that has not been yielded to you. I am instructing you to return to your seat. This is out of order." But she did not budge, nor did she cease her statement. For the first time, the volume of her voice matched his official microphone feed. Her words poured out, each sentence sharpened by the adrenaline coursing through her veins. "If we fail to investigate these anomalies, we fail the public trust. We fail the very constituents who depend on this institution for honesty and integrity." She locked eyes with the chairman. "You can cut off one mic," she said, tone calm but unmistakably forceful, "but as long as there's another in this room, I will make sure the truth is heard." A gasp rippled through the chamber. A bystander stifled an exclamation. The press, newly energized, scrambled to capture every second of this unscripted clash. The chairman's face reddened. He raised the gavel again. "Security," he called out, though softly, like he wasn't certain he wanted them to come forward. The entire scene felt suspended in a precarious balance, one that Jasmine could topple if she pushed too far, and yet that was precisely her intent. She pressed on with her testimony, now ignoring his commands to stop. "I tried to follow every protocol," she said, addressing not just him but the entire room. "I waited for official responses. I filed requests under every legitimate channel. I have the denial letters to prove it." She flipped another page. "Every single time, this institution blocked or delayed me." She felt the slight shift of air behind her. A guard stepped forward tentatively, as if to place a hand on her shoulder, but he was hesitant. He too could sense this was not an ordinary outburst. Something bigger was playing out, a moral line in the sand that, if crossed, would reveal the institution's own complicity in silencing her. She continued to speak, unwavering. The chairman's jaw clenched. He was trapped. If he forcibly removed her, the cameras would capture the brutality of that moment, broadcasting it as an act of blatant suppression. If he let her talk, the entire hearing would spiral out of his tight control. He settled on the only option left, trying to discredit her. "Ms. Crockett," he said, "the so-called evidence you have is nothing more than a series of half-truths, misunderstandings, and standard bureaucratic language. We have experts who've reviewed these documents. They find no impropriety." She turned, her gaze burning. "Name them," she demanded. "Who are these experts, and why were their reviews not made public? Where are their reports?" The briefest moment, the chairman's composure slipped. "I will not engage in a debate with someone who hasn't followed the rules of this hearing," he said. "Your time ended when you failed to appear on schedule." She let out a quiet laugh, though no humor colored her voice. "So, this entire proceeding hinges on my tardiness and not the substance of my evidence? That is a remarkable stance, Mr. Chairman." A nervous ripple spread among the staffers and the small crowd. She could see the faces in the back row, some wearing expressions of shock, others smiling grimly as if they'd just seen something akin to poetic justice. For months, maybe years, they had witnessed people walking into this hearing room, testifying politely, adhering to the strict limits, only to be drowned in legal jargon and bureaucratic intimidation. But now, someone had refused to bow, refused to stay silent. The entire chamber felt alive, thrumming with an energy that many had assumed lost. The guard who had hovered behind her finally withdrew, stepping back with an almost imperceptible nod of respect. She seized that moment to gather her final points. "We live in a time when people are losing faith in these institutions," she continued, voice rising with righteous intensity. "They see what happens behind these walls: broken promises, selective enforcement, injustice dressed up as law. And then they stop believing in any form of accountability. They don't think their voices matter anymore." She looked slowly around the room, letting her words settle on every ear. "It's my duty, my obligation, to bring these facts forward, no matter how inconvenient they may be for those in power." She glanced down at her folder one last time. She could feel the presence of the silent observers, some likely afraid to even nod in agreement for fear of retribution. Then she peered back up at the chairman and concluded, "10 minutes ago, you tried to silence me by turning off my microphone. But let me assure you, this hearing is bigger than a switch, bigger than a gavel. It's about truth, accountability, and the idea that not even the mightiest official can hide from scrutiny forever." He looked poised to interrupt, but her voice surged, cutting him off. "And if you push me out, if you shut me down, I will find another way, another microphone, another hearing, another place to speak. Because you can't stop the truth once it's ready to be told. That is the power you have awakened here today." The hush that followed was visceral. No one dared to move, let alone speak. The clerk, trembling slightly, handled the documents as though they were radioactive. The few spectators who had been scribbling notes now looked up, stunned into a breathless silence. A sense of electric anticipation crackled in the air, a question hanging in the balance. Would the chairman truly try to expel her from the room now, or had she forced his hand, leaving him with no choice but to concede? Finally, he spoke, though his voice was noticeably less commanding. "We will take a brief recess," he announced, tapping the gavel lightly. 15 minutes. He stood abruptly, stepping away from the dais, flanked by two staffers who seemed as rattled as he was. The cameras turned to capture him walking out. He didn't look back. Jasmine exhaled, her shoulders slightly dropping from the tension. But there was no sense of victory in her expression, only resolve. The hearing was adjourned, at least momentarily, and her evidence was on the table. She turned, scanning the faces of those who remained, trying to gauge whether she had done enough or whether they understood the gravity of what she had just risked. One of the reporters in the back looked up, meeting her gaze, a flicker of admiration visible in his expression. Maybe, just maybe, this fight was not in vain. She gathered her papers, double-checking the copies for fear that something might vanish during the recess. In the corridor outside, she expected a barrage of questions, or maybe a last-minute confrontation from security. Instead, she was met with a mixture of supportive nods from a few onlookers and the watchful stares of the chairman's aides, who hovered near the walls like silent sentinels. She found a quiet corner to breathe, to recenter, to remind herself that this was only the beginning. The moment the recess ended, the hearing would resume. She didn't know if they'd acknowledge the evidence or attempt to bury it anew. But she did know that by taking control of that second microphone, she had changed the script. The next act would be fraught with attempts to discredit her, to twist her words or question her motives. She took a moment, mentally preparing for every possible angle they might use. She could almost hear the lines they'd throw at her. "She's grandstanding. She's seeking attention. This is merely political theater." She steadied herself for each scornful remark. None of it would deter her from what she knew to be right. When the hearing reconvened, the chairman's seat remained empty for a time, prompting murmurs in the room. An assistant cleared her throat nervously, shuffled a few papers, and announced that there would be a delay. Jasmine took her seat again at the witness table, her posture upright, gaze unwavering. She refused to make small talk or show any hint of nervousness. She simply waited, the folder of documents laying closed but ready in front of her. A surge of regret flickered in her mind, regret that she hadn't had more time to brief her allies. Perhaps if more people had known what she planned, there would be a coordinated effort to back her up. But the reality was that trust was a scarce commodity. Even those who supported her goals might have balked at the direct confrontation she had just delivered. She understood their fear. Consequences could be dire for anyone openly challenging entrenched power. Her reflection was interrupted by the chairman's return. He strode in with tight-lipped determination, his eyes flicked to her, revealing his anger, but he took his seat with careful calm, tapping the microphone in front of him. "We are resuming the hearing," he said. "I trust that all participants will observe proper decorum and follow the established procedures." His voice was deliberate, each syllable hammered down like a subtle threat. She offered a polite nod, neither submissive nor openly defiant. The hush in the chamber was stifling. A few coughs and shifting seats, but otherwise no one dared to speak out of turn. The energy felt like a ticking clock, counting down to an explosive confrontation. Jasmine knew the next few minutes would be pivotal. "Mrs. Crockett," the chairman said, emphasizing her last name, "we have decided to allow your documents into the record for review. However, we will also be placing an official note on your conduct this morning, which I consider to be inappropriate for these proceedings." He paused, scanning the faces in the room, looking for any sign of agreement or dissent. "Now, do you have anything further to say that pertains directly to the matter at hand?" She inhaled, fortifying herself. "Thank you, Mr. Chairman," she began, voice carefully measured. She was acutely aware that her primary microphone was now reactivated, possibly under the chairman's watchful control. "I will restate that these documents raise serious questions about awarding contracts outside normal channels, and I believe an independent investigation is warranted. I request that a committee, separate from those involved, be established to examine the legality of these actions." The chairman listened without moving, his expression impassive. "And do you have any evidence of direct criminal wrongdoing?" She met his gaze. "These documents suggest fraud and intentional misappropriation of public funds. If that is not direct criminal wrongdoing, then I need clarification on what this body considers a felony offense." She caught a slight twitch in his eyebrow. "That's why transparency is crucial. An independent review can determine the extent of violations." A low murmur passed through the gallery. She recognized the tension. This was exactly the type of request that the powers in charge did not want. An independent investigation would bring outside eyes, impartial scrutiny, and potentially unstoppable momentum. She watched the chairman weigh his words. He finally spoke, each phrase carefully selected. "It is not within the purview of this hearing to authorize or compel an independent investigative committee." He paused, possibly for effect. "We can, however, forward your concerns to the appropriate oversight bodies." She nodded, trying to keep her frustration at bay. "And will you do so?" he responded with a thin, disingenuous smile. "We will review your submission and decide on the merits." Then he leaned back, effectively signaling that her time was drawing to a close. Yet she refused to let him orchestrate her exit. She stood, placing both hands on the table to steady herself. She sensed the entire room bracing for another confrontation. "I came here under the impression that truth is not an inconvenience, that due process is not optional, and that the public's right to know supersedes the personal discomfort of officials." She allowed her words to linger, voice steady but laced with an undercurrent of moral urgency. "If I was mistaken, let the record reflect that." His only response was silence, broken by the periodic click of a camera shutter. Then he turned his microphone off, a quiet but pointed gesture that declared the session was effectively over, at least for him. She looked around, noticing how officials began to gather their papers and avoid eye contact. In that moment, she felt a wave of exhaustion. Standing up to authority demanded immense energy, and it often felt like shouting into the void. But the memory of that second microphone, of her voice booming through the room, despite their attempts to silence her, revitalized her. As she made her way toward the exit, reporters converged. They hurled questions she could hardly process in real time. "Ms. Crockett, do you believe there's a cover-up? Are you concerned about repercussions? Will you be filing a lawsuit? Is there enough evidence to prosecute?" She tried to answer politely, but her mind swirled with the gravity of what had just taken place. She repeated her mantra, "I believe in accountability. The evidence is there. We need an unbiased body to act on it. Outside, the grand staircase leading from the hearing room to the street was crowded with protesters, bystanders, and more reporters. A few had signs that read, "We stand with truth, no more corruption, and justice for the public." She wasn't sure when they'd arrived, but their presence was a testament to the growing frustration with governmental opacity. She walked down the steps slowly, head high, refusing to let the exhaustion bend her posture. Applause broke out, and it felt both strange and comforting. She gave a small nod of appreciation, not wanting to turn this into a spectacle, but also aware of the collective relief this moment represented for many. Someone called her name, and she turned to see a timid woman in a simple blouse, tears brimming in her eyes. "Thank you," the woman said softly, "for saying what so many of us can't." Jasmine touched the woman's arm gently. "I'm doing what I can," she replied. "Please hold me accountable too. We all have a role." The rest of the crowd pressed in, and she was swept into a wave of questions, handshakes, and hurried steps toward a waiting car. She realized that the next phase of her battle would likely be fought outside the hearing room, in press conferences, interviews, and maybe even court filings. The day had only just begun in terms of the fallout. But as the door of the car closed behind her, she allowed herself a single moment of quiet reflection. She replayed the hearing in her mind, focusing on the pivotal moment when they cut her mic the first time. She recalled the flash of indignation that surged through her, how it spurred her to seize the second mic. That fleeting decision made in a split second had changed the entire narrative. Instead of being a victim of institutional silencing, she became a symbol of resistance. She remembered the hush that fell over the room when she refused to back down, and how her words had resonated in the hearts of those who dared to listen. Yes, the chairman had retreated behind procedures and half-promises. Yes, the system might still smother her evidence if they found it convenient to do so, but no one could erase the record of what had just happened. The hearing was publicly documented, witnessed by journalists, activists, and inevitably by the broader public once news outlets ran the footage. She found solace in that small but critical fact. A truth spoken, even in a hostile environment, had a way of reverberating beyond the walls intended to contain it. She used the car ride to call a trusted colleague, summarizing the morning's events, and ensuring that digital copies of her evidence were backed up, stored securely, and shared with multiple contacts. She knew the first rule of whistleblowing: never keep all your evidence in one place. Redundancy was her shield against sabotage or lost files. Once done, she leaned back against the seat, closing her eyes as the sun streamed through the window. In the hours that followed, her phone buzzed incessantly with messages of support and frantic calls from acquaintances who had caught wind of the confrontation. One call came from a well-known civil rights lawyer offering pro bono counsel in case the institution retaliated. Another came from a journalist at a national outlet requesting an exclusive interview. Through each conversation, she repeated the same conviction: it's not about me. It's about what's in those documents and how they reflect a larger rot in the system. I'm just carrying the message. She had never been one to shy away from adversity, but the scale of the challenge now loomed larger than ever. She could almost feel the institution preparing its countermeasures, quietly leaning on key figures in the press to discredit her, or rallying political allies to question her credibility. She clutched her phone tighter, reminding herself that fear was exactly what they wanted her to feel. She wouldn't give them that satisfaction. By late afternoon, she was standing behind a makeshift podium outside a local community center, addressing a small gathering of residents and reporters. The sun was dipping low, casting a soft golden glow. "I won't pretend this will be easy," she told them, her voice projecting through a borrowed speaker system. "But real change never is. We have to persist, keep raising our voices, keep showing up. I promise that I will continue to fight for an investigation into these abuses of power." The modest crowd applauded, their support fueling her resolve. She glanced down at the notes she'd scrawled moments before stepping up. Bullet points about the hearing, the significance of the documents, the need for public pressure. She felt more confident speaking freely, so she pushed the notes aside, letting her passion guide her words. "They tried to silence me in that hearing room, but they didn't succeed, and they won't succeed if we stand together." Somewhere in the crowd, a child perched on a parent's shoulders raised a small, handwritten sign that read, "Truth wins." Jasmine's eyes momentarily glistened at the innocence of the message. She believed in it wholeheartedly, even though she knew the path to actualizing that truth would be littered with obstacles. She ended her speech with a rallying call. We must hold our leaders accountable. Every institution, every official must be transparent to the people they serve. This isn't a radical idea, it's the foundation of democracy. As dusk approached, she found a moment to slip away from the crowd, letting community organizers handle the remaining questions. She walked around the corner of the center, taking a moment to breathe in the evening air tinted with the scent of summer grass. She thought back to the hearing, reflecting on the odd mix of tension and empowerment that had washed over her in those pivotal moments. Something fundamental had shifted. She could feel it in her bones. She had walked into that room as a petitioner, playing by their rules. She left it as someone who had, even briefly, seized the reins. Her phone buzzed again. This time, the voice on the other end belonged to a longtime contact in a national advocacy group. They wanted to coordinate a broader campaign, harnessing the attention she had generated and channeling it into sustained pressure for an independent investigation. She agreed, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. Maybe the hearing's fleeting confrontation could blossom into a movement that forced the issue out of the shadows. Eventually, under the stars, she returned to her modest apartment. The hum of the city enveloped her, a reminder that life went on even when institutions tried to choke off inconvenient truths. She dropped her bag on the kitchen table, placed the crucial documents in a fireproof safe, and sank onto the couch. Her limbs felt heavy, almost numb, with the weight of the day's events. But exhaustion couldn't erase the sense of resolve that pulsed through her. She replayed her next steps in her mind: compile and publish a detailed summary of the documents for wider media consumption, coordinate with the lawyer who had offered help, prepare statements for potential legal challenges, and keep shining a light on what the chairman and his allies might do to contain or spin the story. It was a lot for one person. She thought about how she might build a coalition, incorporate experts, and channel community support. A fight like this required more than one brave voice. It required a chorus. Late into the night, she drifted off to sleep, only to wake early the next morning to a flurry of headlines. Some outlets praised her courage, framing her Mike takeover as a symbolic stand against corruption. Others dismissed her as a grandstander with vague accusations. Predictably, certain political commentators declared her a partisan hack. She absorbed it all, her eyes scanning the screen. Every narrative told a piece of the story, but never the entire truth. The impetus was on her to keep the facts straight, to make sure the public didn't get lost in the noise of competing agendas. Before long, an unlisted number appeared on her screen. She answered tentatively, half expecting a hostile voice. Instead, a calm, composed woman introduced herself as an internal investigator from a reputable government oversight agency. She had seen snippets of the hearing footage and wanted to talk about the next steps. The call was guarded. They both knew phones could be monitored, but the investigator left her personal extension, inviting Jasmine to share additional materials through unofficial channels. The seeds of a potential formal inquiry were being planted, albeit quietly and cautiously. The day spiraled into a cascade of urgent tasks: a meeting with the civil rights lawyer to discuss the potential grounds for a lawsuit, a quick stop at a local radio station for a brief interview, and a conference call with the advocacy group ready to mobilize an online campaign. She fielded each demand with a steady determination, though the unrelenting pace threatened to fray her nerves. At times, she wondered if the chairman had expected her to crumble under the pressure. If so, he had underestimated her fortitude and the public's appetite for accountability. As evening fell, she found herself back in front of the community center, where a larger crowd had gathered than the day before. They wanted updates on the hearing, the documents, and any signs of official retaliation. Cameras flashed, smartphone screens lit up, capturing her every gesture. She spoke from the steps, voice amplified by a small portable speaker. She explained that while no formal investigation had been announced, she was working to secure that outcome. The crowd cheered when she asserted that nobody, regardless of rank or title, should be above the law. Mid-speech, she spotted someone emerging from a car at the curb, a figure wearing a neutral expression, flanked by two aides. It was someone from the institution, possibly an assistant to a high-ranking official. The person did not approach the crowd but lingered near the edges, seemingly observing. Jasmine recognized the hallmark of a surveillance tactic. They were gauging her support, evaluating whether she was a lone voice or a genuine threat backed by public sentiment. She refused to let it rattle her. Instead, she found herself raising her voice a little more, bridging the gap between her convictions and the hearts of the listeners. Her words soared. The truth doesn't vanish when a microphone is switched off. It doesn't bow to convenience or intimidation. It endures, just waiting for someone brave enough to speak it out loud. The crowd applauded with renewed vigor, and the observer at the curb scribbled notes, retreating discreetly. Over the next few days, she continued her relentless push. The hearing's abrupt end had not yet been rescheduled, presumably because the chairman's office was deciding how to proceed without inflaming the controversy. More media outlets requested interviews, some friendly, others clearly fishing for a scandal that could discredit her. She took them all, focusing on the evidence rather than her personal story. She highlighted the financial anomalies, the questionable signatories, and the pattern of withheld information. She hammered home the importance of an independent audit or special counsel. Each time she made sure to remind the public that she wasn't the story. The system's potential misconduct was. Private threats began to surface in her inbox. Anonymous emails warning her to back off or quit meddling. She reported them to the lawyer and forwarded them to a contact in law enforcement for documentation. Fear gnawed at her late at night, but she had come too far to abandon her stand. She tightened her security measures, changed her phone number, and shared her schedule with only a trusted circle. The intimidation only hardened her resolve because it proved that powerful interests were feeling cornered. In the midst of this turmoil, a flicker of hope arrived in the form of a leaked memo from inside the very department that had awarded the suspect contracts. The memo corroborated some of her findings, referencing preferential awarding and back-channel approvals. It was a smoking gun, or close to it. As soon as she verified its authenticity, she released it to the public. She expected an immediate backlash, but something else happened. Other staffers began to speak up, quietly at first, confirming that they too had witnessed irregularities. A chain reaction was ignited, one voice emboldening another. This incremental groundswell unsettled the chairman's allies. Reports trickled in that they were meeting behind closed doors, strategizing a damage control approach. Rumors circulated that they might offer up a scapegoat or a lesser official to take the fall, hoping to shield higher-ups. Jasmine anticipated the narrative shift. We found a bad apple and we've remedied the situation. But she knew the corruption ran deeper than one or two rogue actors. If the public pressure held, they might be able to unearth the entire network of complicity. A week after the infamous hearing, news broke that the chairman had scheduled a follow-up session to address the swirling questions about the contracts and Jasmine's claims. The announcement was cryptic, giving no assurances about how open the session would be or whether she would be allowed to speak again. But she prepared nonetheless, gathering every piece of evidence, every testimony from insiders, and every statement of support she'd received from community leaders. She intended to march back into that chamber fully armed with facts and the moral mandate she'd cultivated. The day of the follow-up session arrived. The hearing room brimmed with an even larger audience than before, many spectators motivated by what they had seen and read during the past week. Jasmine stood near the entrance, waiting to be called in. She wore a modest but sharp outfit, the same determined expression etched on her face. A hush settled as the chairman and his panel took their seats. She caught his eye. He looked weary, perhaps realizing that controlling the narrative would be more difficult now. An official announced the hearing's start. The chairman tapped his gavel lightly, scanning the crowded room. Cameras zoomed in on him, waiting for his opening remarks. He cleared his throat. In light of recent developments, this body has decided to address the allegations of impropriety in the awarding of certain contracts. We will review evidence and hear testimonies from relevant parties, including Ms. Jasmine Crockett. He paused, his gaze briefly connecting with hers. We ask that all parties adhere to the protocols and time limits set forth. She recognized the subtext. They would give her a voice, but under their tight constraints. She accepted the challenge, stepping forward when her name was called. This time, the microphone in front of her was operational from the start, but she didn't fully trust it. She gave a small nod to the clerk, who seemed sympathetic, then began. Thank you for convening this session. As I've stated, the documents now in the public domain point to unauthorized allocations and potential fraud. She outlined key points methodically, ensuring each detail was on the record. She also cited the leaked memo and the statements from unnamed staffers, noting that some had come forward at great personal risk. The chairman listened, arms folded, face set in a stony mask. When she finished, he began a series of questions, some of them pointed, aimed at poking holes in her credibility, others more general, as though he was going through the motions of due diligence. She answered calmly, determined not to let emotion overshadow the clarity of her facts. Still, the tension in her voice was evident when he insinuated she had political motivations. She shot back politely, "My motivation is accountability. Whether it's politically convenient or not is irrelevant." A murmur of approval rippled through the crowd. The chairman's nostrils flared, but he maintained his official composure. The hearing stretched on, with various officials taking turns to question her. Occasionally, she perceived attempts to entrap her in technicalities, asking about dates, processes, and regulatory details. She navigated each question, referencing her documents or clarifying the limitations of her knowledge. She made it clear that she was not an investigator with the full resources of the state, but a concerned citizen with enough proof to warrant official scrutiny. The more they pressed her, the more the public seemed to appreciate her straightforward candor. At one critical juncture, an official asked her to confirm the authenticity of the leaked memo. She stated that she believed it to be legitimate, having cross-checked certain references with the original documents. The official pressed further, hinting that admitting reliance on a leaked document might be unethical. She calmly responded, "The greater ethical breach would be ignoring the wrongdoing these documents expose." That line drew a small, immediate applause, which the chairman quickly attempted to quell with a sharp tap of his gavel. Jasmine sensed the mood shifting. She felt the intangible weight of public sentiment gathering behind her. Even those who might have been skeptical were beginning to see that the institution's deflections and accusations didn't hold up under scrutiny. At one point, the chairman tried to interrupt again, possibly to curtail her speaking time, but she politely asked for one more moment to clarify, citing the importance of accuracy. He relented, perhaps conscious that cutting her off again would look terrible in front of a room packed with reporters. By the end of the session, she had laid out her evidence thoroughly, weaving in the personal testimonies of staffers who, for now, remained anonymous to protect their jobs. She called once more for an independent investigation, reminding everyone that the public's trust was at stake. The chairman gave no definitive response, only stating that the panel would consider all information carefully and proceed in accordance with the law. As she stepped away from the witness table, she caught sight of the same guard who had once approached her from behind when she grabbed that second microphone. He nodded at her, just slightly, an unspoken acknowledgement of her perseverance. She offered a small nod in return, remembering that single moment in which she had chosen to stand up rather than be silenced. In the flurry of the hearing's conclusion, people rising from seats, cameras powering off, staffers packing up, she felt a swirl of conflicting emotions. Relief that she had been heard, at least in part, anxiety over what the institution might do next, but also a deep, resonant pride in how she had refused to let them strip her voice away. As she exited the chamber, the corridor erupted with reporters. This time, she held her hand up, signaling she would make a brief statement. They formed a semicircle around her, microphones and recorders thrust forward. She kept it concise. "I'm grateful for the opportunity to present these findings. I urge the panel to act swiftly and transparently. Today was a step forward, but real change demands continuous pressure from the public." With that, she offered no further comments, stepping briskly toward an elevator guarded by a uniformed officer who appeared more respectful than imposing. The elevator ride down felt surreal. She locked eyes with her own reflection in the metallic doors. The exhaustion was apparent, but so was a certain fire. She remembered the initial plan, to present her evidence politely, within the rules, hoping someone in power would see reason and champion her cause. Then she remembered the raw humiliation of that moment when they'd switched off her microphone and how, in the following 10 minutes, everything changed. She had claimed her right to speak, rewriting the script they had laid out for her. That single act of rebellion had resonated far beyond the walls of that hearing room, igniting a discussion about accountability that could not easily be extinguished. When the doors opened, she stepped into the lobby, where more community members waited. They greeted her with cautious smiles and quiet words of encouragement. Some had tears in their eyes. Others simply offered a handshake or a pat on the shoulder. She felt their relief, their gratitude, and also their expectation. They were counting on her to keep pushing until the full truth emerged. She accepted that responsibility, knowing it extended well beyond her personal reputation or comfort. "Ms. Crockett," a voice called from behind. She turned to see a middle-aged man with a well-regarded magazine. He asked if she would agree to an in-depth interview to explore the broader implications of her revelations. She nodded, exchanging contact information. The man smiled gratefully. "Thank you for not giving up," he said. "We need people like you." Stepping outside, she inhaled the fresh air, the midday sun warming her face. She remembered that first hearing vividly, the snide remarks, the forced hush, the flickering green light that finally died on her microphone. That had been the institution's attempt to shut her down, to confine her words to a silent vacuum. They had failed. 10 minutes later, she had hijacked the hearing, not through brute force, but by refusing to accept their premise that silence was her only option. A gentle breeze carried the distant sounds of bustling traffic, everyday life continuing as usual, but her life had changed drastically. She walked down the courthouse steps, recalling the wave of euphoria and fear that had washed over her when she grabbed that second mic. She had never felt so vulnerable or so alive. The journey ahead was uncertain, fraught with challenges from those who feared exposure. Yet as she pressed onward, she carried with her the undeniable proof that a single voice could disrupt a carefully controlled hearing, and that once awakened, that voice resonated in the hearts of many. That night, in a modest hotel conference room rented by a coalition of reform-minded activists, she shared her experiences in a roundtable discussion. Community leaders, local politicians with integrity, and grassroots organizers gathered to hear her insights and plan the next steps. She realized that her personal fight had grown into a collective movement. Conversations buzzed about filing formal petitions, staging peaceful demonstrations, and pressuring the panel to address the evidence without delay. They mapped out strategies to engage more citizens, to gather personal stories from those affected by such corruption, and to ensure that every attempt at a cover-up would be met with relentless scrutiny. Jasmine felt simultaneously overwhelmed and uplifted. In a single week, she had gone from a lone voice in a chamber designed to mute her to a central figure in a burgeoning quest for justice. She recognized that the scrutiny would only intensify, that the defenders of the status quo would throw every obstacle in her path. Yet the unwavering support filling that small conference room reminded her that she wasn't alone. She had found allies who believed in the same principles: transparency, accountability, and the irrepressible power of truth. As the meeting concluded, a tall, soft-spoken woman approached her. She introduced herself as a former clerk who had worked in the same office that issued the contested contracts. She had detailed knowledge of the processes and was now prepared to testify on the condition that she receive some form of protection. Jasmine listened attentively, heart pounding at the realization of how crucial this testimony could be. She exchanged contact information, promising to do everything she could to facilitate a safe environment for the woman to come forward. It was a promise she intended to keep, no matter how difficult. In the weeks that followed, the activism spread. Local newspapers ran op-eds demanding transparency. National outlets began paying attention as well, linking the situation to a broader pattern of institutional abuses in other jurisdictions. Social media lit up with hashtags supporting Jasmine's fight for answers. Political leaders from other corners of the spectrum chimed in cautiously, some expressing concern about the allegations, others denying the possibility of wrongdoing. The conversation became national, with Jasmine's name and the phrase "mic cut" trending for days on end. Meanwhile, inside the institution, quiet turmoil brewed. Staff changes, resignations, and behind-the-scenes deals were rumored. The chairman, once so sure of his ability to dictate the script, now found himself bombarded with calls for accountability. It wasn't an outright victory, far from it, but the fortress of secrecy was showing cracks. And through those cracks, sunlight was starting to pour in. Jasmine maintained a careful balance in public appearances, never letting the media circus overshadow the evidence. She consistently redirected attention to the contracts, the signatures, the missing funds. She hammered home the same point. It's about systemic misuse of power. She refused to be turned into a sensational headline devoid of substance. When interviewers asked personal questions about her background, her motives, her emotional state, she answered briefly, always pivoting back to the documents. If they tried to sensationalize her confrontation in the hearing, she reminded them why she was forced into that position in the first place. Gradually, she saw the conversation shift. Instead of focusing on the spectacle of her commandeering the mic, commentators began diving into the specifics of the alleged corruption. Experts weighed in, analyzing the documents she had provided. Other whistleblowers from parallel agencies started to speak out, forming a mosaic of evidence that suggested a larger pattern. This broader context validated Jasmine's claims, making it harder for skeptics to dismiss her as merely dramatic or rebellious. Months later, an independent review board was finally convened, albeit under intense public pressure. The hearing that once threatened to stifle her became the catalyst for a more comprehensive investigation. Officials who had insisted there was no story found themselves compelled to testify, submit records, and answer pointed questions in public sessions, broadcast live. The chairman, who had overshadowed Jasmine with his gavel and disapproving glare, was called to account for why he had allowed her microphone to be cut. He gave a carefully worded statement about technical malfunctions, though few believed his explanation. In the final twist, the board announced it would recommend a full forensic audit of the department's contracts and budgets from the past 3 years. That alone represented a seismic shift. Where once the notion of an outside audit was dismissed, it had now become a necessity. The undercurrent of public outrage, the media coverage, and the persistent demands for clarity had forced the institution's hand. Jasmine heard the news in a terse press release and almost felt her legs buckle with relief. She allowed herself a fleeting smile before returning to her desk to plan next steps. She knew audits took time, and the forces that opposed her might still intervene. But this was tangible progress. In her quiet apartment after reading the news, she put on a pot of tea and sat by the window, gazing at the city lights. She thought about that moment when her mic went dead and the room stilled in oppressive silence. She remembered the flush of anger and the wave of resolve that pushed her to find another mic. That short act of defiance, though it felt like an eternity in her memory, had spanned barely 10 minutes. Yet in those few minutes, she shifted the trajectory of the hearing, and potentially of an entire institution. She sipped her tea, letting the steam warm her face, reflecting on how power tries to silence those who challenge it. But real power, she realized, springs from integrity and the courage to speak when a system insists you stay silent. That second microphone was there, a simple piece of technology, but in her hands, it became a megaphone for accountability that echoed far beyond the ornate walls of the hearing room. And so she resolved once more that no matter what came next, she would continue to press forward. Whether it took months or years, whether the institution tried to rehabilitate its image by scapegoating a few low-level functionaries, or truly implemented deep reforms, she would remain vigilant. With an entire community and an expanding network of advocates behind her, the possibility of real change felt more tangible than ever before. The next morning, she woke up to a flood of messages congratulating her on the audit decision. Reporters wanted her reaction. Officials sent cautious invitations to collaborate, and strangers reached out with stories of their own struggles against bureaucratic impunity. She took a moment to bask in a sense of accomplishment, tempered by the knowledge that the real work of reform was only beginning. As she prepared for the day, she considered how to channel this wave of momentum. Perhaps a public forum where people could share their experiences, or a legal fund to protect future whistleblowers, or a grassroots campaign pushing for systemic safeguards to ensure no one else would have to hijack a hearing just to be heard. Each idea crackled with possibility. The platform she had unintentionally built was now a responsibility she carried. By midday, she found herself recounting the events of that climactic 10 minutes in the hearing to a national journalist in a phone interview. She carefully avoided dramatizing it, focusing instead on the broader message. It shouldn't require an act of defiance to shine a light on corruption, she said, but if that's what it takes, I'm willing to do it again. and I hope others realize they have that power too. When she hung up, she felt a swirl of emotions: pride, caution, exhaustion, and an undercurrent of hope. Those same emotions would accompany her in the months ahead, as the audit and potential legal proceedings played out. But no matter the outcome, a fundamental truth had been established. A lone individual, backed by moral conviction and evidence, could challenge a seemingly unassailable institution. Late that night, while reviewing documents for an upcoming interview, she paused to reflect on the significance of the hearing's pivotal moment. They tried to cut off Jasmine Crockett's mic, but they only succeeded in amplifying her resolve. She hijacked the hearing not in a bid for personal glory, but out of a fierce, unyielding commitment to the truth, and in doing so, she set off a chain of events that would reverberate far beyond that single room, sparking a movement that insisted on transparency, accountability, and a renewed faith in the power of ordinary people to make a difference. She closed her laptop and leaned back in her chair, letting the gravity of it all wash over her. It wasn't a fairy tale ending, real life rarely offered that, but it was a beginning, a necessary jolt that rattled the walls of complacency. She understood that there would be more battles ahead, more attempts to silence voices like hers. But the memory of that day reminded her, and anyone who had witnessed it, that sometimes all it takes is one unwavering voice, one courageous stand, and one unyielding refusal to be silenced, to remind the world that truth can still triumph when least expected.